Good afternoon. My name is Lucan Wei. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro-Yasek program for the study of Ukraine. Today, we're going to discuss Zelensky's leadership, but given what's going on in Ukraine, I really want to begin by acknowledging the horrific attacks by Russia on Ukraine that are going on right now, attacks on civilian targets that have no military value, including kindergartens. And overall, since the February invasion, there have been nearly 10,000 Ukrainian civilians killed. So therefore, I would like to take a minute silence to acknowledge those atrocities. Okay. So to begin, when I came of age in the late 1980s, during the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world had sort of a number of kind of heroes, Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, who were known for their courageous leadership in overcoming dictatorships and leading, new liberal societies. Unfortunately, at the time, while Ukraine was a democracy, none of them was Ukrainian. Today, there are a few more admired figures on the world stage than Vladimir Zelensky, who has captured the world's imagination by leading a David versus Goliath struggle against Russian imperialism and winning. So today, we're just joined by five distinguished panelists to discuss Zelensky's leadership and his leadership of Ukraine. First, we have Emily Channell-Justice, who's the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Most recently, she has published a book, Without the State, Self-Organization and Political Activism in Ukraine. That was just came out, or actually, I'm sorry, I understand it's going to come out in December of this year with the University of Toronto Press. Next, we have our own Marta Dyczok, who's Associate Professor of the Department of History and Political Science at Western University. She's member of the advisory board of the Petro-Yasek program. She's published 5 books as an analyst of media politics and has recently written a fascinating piece, an analysis of Zelensky's communication strategies during the war. And I believe we're going to post all of these publications on the Q&A link. Next, from Ukraine, he's here as long as his electricity holds out. Vladimir Kulik, he's the head research fellow, Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. He's taught at almost every Western institution at Columbia, Stanford, Yale, Kyiv Mohyla, the Ukrainian Catholic University, and has held research fellowships at Harvard, Stanford, Woodrow Wilson Center, University of College London, University of Alberta, and many others. Next, from the United Kingdom, we have Dr. Olga Anuk, who is also formerly here as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. She is a professor at the University of Manchester, where she has been since 2014. And she has just published a book, when is it coming out, Olga?
November 17th.
November, so very soon, which is very apropos. It's called the Zelensky Effect with Henry Hale. Finally, last but not least, we have my good friend Jessica Pisano, who's Associate Professor of Politics at the New School for Social Research. She writes and teaches on contemporary 20th century politics in Eastern Europe. She has actually published a book. It's already out. You can buy it. It's a wonderful book. I've read it. Very fascinating. Called Staging Democracy, Political Performance in Ukraine, Russia, and Beyond with Cornell University Press. So let's begin the discussion. I'm going to start with you, Emily. Can you sort of talk about the 2019 election of Zelensky? How was this? I mean, he was the 5th president of Ukraine. My count is right. How is this election different from others in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be here with the other great panelists. And I think I've been, of course, revising my book up until pretty recently and kind of going back to that time period of 2013 and 2014, and then what happened in the years after that, and looking at the Poroshenko presidency. And a lot, I mean, I think we really have to go back to 2014 to understand what happened in 2019, because the context there, of course, is that after the Euromaidan protests, we have this rejuvenation of what we can call civil society actors. We have a whole new type of political engagement. And I think at that point, we also have a whole new expectation of what the president should be doing and what the president's obligation to the citizens are. And importantly, what the citizen response could be if the president can't meet those expectations. And so in 2019, when we have President Poroshenko going up against candidate Zelensky, the problem for Poroshenko is really that he has not done enough to meet the expectations of enough groups. And I think here it's also important to recognize the plurality of kinds of people making demands on Poroshenko. And the disappointment of so much of that plurality is where Zelensky, I think, is able to insert himself, because we can recall that his kind of platform in his candidacy was not very concrete. It was very open-ended. It was we could possibly say it was designed to kind of allow people to fill in the blanks, so that when Poroshenko is this known candidate, we know what he's bringing to the table, we know what he's going to do. Nobody really knows what Zelensky is going to do, but the opportunity is there and the possibility is there, and people read possibility into what he's presenting instead of whereas Poroshenko, of course, and I should add some of the other candidates who ran in the previous rounds, including, for example, Yulia Tymoshenko, these are people who are well established. We know what we're getting into. Zelensky offers a totally blank slate, and I think that was appealing to a lot of people.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm going to turn to you, Jessica. You've written about, a lot about theater and politics, and it just so happens that the current president of Ukraine comes out of the theater. Can you talk about you've written about the impact of Zelensky's sort of background in comedy, and can you talk about its impact on his presidency?
Sure. Thanks very much for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other panelists. So if we think about Zelensky's role himself, right, in the context of this changing societal landscape, one of the things that I like to think about with respect to his comedy background, his theater background, and the fact that Ukrainians knew him for longer than Russians have known Putin, right, have known Vladimir Zelensky, right, as a Russified, Russian-speaking comedic presence on the stage, on television, broadcast throughout the Soviet world, post-Soviet world, since the mid-90s, right? So even as it wasn't clear what his policies would be, many Ukrainians felt they knew the person. So I think that's sort of a first and key thing to understand about the legacy of his stage presence, that through his participation in improv comedy, KVN, he and his troops, starting with Zaporizhzhia Kryvyi Rih Transit in the 90s, clearly communicated political positions, right? So even if people didn't know what precise neoliberally inflected policies he would implement as president, they certainly had a sense of where he stood on things, those who had cared to watch him starting in that period, and then through Вечерний Kvartal and all of the other shows up until the elections. So if we think about theater and Zelensky, I think the main takeaway here is that all of the other previous Ukrainian presidents, with maybe one or two exceptions, but certainly any Ukrainian politician who had any kind of leanings toward the Kremlin tended to use a system of governance which relied very heavily on theater, using salaries, payoffs, all kinds of different economic pressures to compel people to offer shows of support. So in this sense, sort of the entire political system operates in a theatrical mode. Zelensky really takes theater out of Ukrainian politics in this sense by removing economic pressure that people felt to participate individually. But if we look at his use of his theater background and his use of Aristotelian form, which is something he does maintain, he uses a narrative, right, that ends in catharsis, and all the stories that he tells about politics that really draw people in. But the difference, as I talk about in a forthcoming article in the Journal of Peace and War Studies, is that Zelensky, rather than involving people as background players, right, who are kind of compelled onto the stage, or rather than involving them as spectators who feel what's happening on the stage, he asks people to participate in what's happening on the stage. We can see this in his international interventions, where for each country's parliament that he addressed earlier in the full-scale invasion, he asked people to think about their own experiences. He asked Americans to think about September 11th. He asked Germans to think about the fall of the wall. And in doing so, he asked people to become participants in that political theater. And so even as previous Ukrainian presidents had asked people to be background players,
so
it's a really important set of implications for shifts in politics, I think, during this war and will after victory. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to you, Volodya. As you know, obviously, Zelensky was elected with 73% of the vote. Nonetheless, I've noticed from many Ukrainians I know, and certainly in the diaspora here in Toronto, there was a fair amount of antipathy. This is before the most recent invasion, towards Zelensky. Can you talk about the sources of this kind of opposition and to Zelensky, and sort of how the war has changed that, or not?
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad to be able to talk here as long as communal services provide me electricity and Ukrainian anti-aircraft defense provides me shelter against Russian rockets. Yeah, so I'm probably one of those people who didn't know Zelensky as well as Jessica says most Ukrainian citizens did. I was rather surprised that so many of them did know him so well and like him so much. Yeah. So, and actually that was our ignorance of that extent of liking was partly our problem, and contributed to our perception that his election might be problematic, might be even catastrophic in somebody's opinion. So, what factors contributed to this perception that his election would be highly problematic? First, obviously, a lack of political experience, and as long as he started his campaign, he avoided talking directly to journalists and to the public. So yeah, he was kind of hidden, sheltered by his campaign from the public. Yeah, so they provided references to his series, and they provided some clips, but not himself, because as soon as he started talking directly, improvising, it was obvious that he has a very vague idea of what he was talking about and what he was preparing to implement as if elected president. Yeah. So then, for patriotic citizens, there was this problematic discourse of Kvartal 95 at his comedy show on some sensitive topics of Ukrainian history and contemporary developments like Euromaidan or attitudes to the Holodomor, for example. Yeah, so that lack of sensitivity, lack of understanding how important, how I would even say sacred this is for many Ukrainians. Yeah, so for many of those who he expected actually to be voting for him. Then there was this very problematic discourse, in our opinion, on how he was going to proceed to stop the war in the Donbass. This notorious phrase on one just need to stop shooting, надо просто перестать стрелять. Yeah, so it was obvious to us that it was Putin who didn't want to stop shooting. Yeah, and Ukrainians could not just stop shooting as long as Putin didn't want to. So was it naivete, or was it some even said it might be a sign that he was going to betray us in some ways? Yeah, so that was also problematic, and he was not there to explain, because he was at that time he was unable to explain what exactly he meant, how far he was prepared to concede, and so on, and so on. Yeah, and finally there was this aspect of his relations to oligarchs. We didn't know much about that, but there were allegations that he was dependent on them, and it was obvious that his show appeared for a number of years on oligarchic channels, and it was clear that Kolomoisky, the owner of 1+1 channel, he didn't even pretend that he was not interested in election of Zelensky as president to have some better fortunes for his businesses. So all these factors contributed to skepticism at best, and catastrophic expectations at worst. Yeah, and I must say, even though you still didn't ask me that, but I must say that. Of course, we saw that he was learning, he was improving tremendously. Yeah, starting with his Ukrainian, it was also problematic that he was virtually unable to say a few words in Ukrainian. Yeah, so having been living most of his life in independent Ukraine, that was also a problem. Yeah, but he was improving both in terms of language and in terms of his understanding of politics, and in terms of his communicative style in many senses. Yeah, but of course there remain a number of problematic aspects, of which I assume they're going to talk later. I stop here.
Okay, thank you. So Olga, you've written a book appropriately titled the Zelensky Effect. So can you talk? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Sorry. Okay. What is the Zelensky effect? And can you talk about the impact of his election?
Well, the Zelensky effect is already what my colleagues have been talking about, and clearly interest in Zelensky has grown in the last year, not only amongst my colleagues and their work, but also just in the broader media. The thing is, and as Volodya can attest to this, I've been talking about the Zelensky effect from 2019 onwards. I was equally as surprised, and I've written about the Zelensky effect from 2019 onwards. I was equally as surprised as Volodya. I was one of those people, and Marta recalls those early conversations, I'm sure as well in Kyiv, where we were surprised by how Zelensky was being received by the general electorate, and also how we missed this huge thing about what Zelensky has been conveying in his election campaign speeches, more concretely through a variety of means that we weren't paying attention, but also to that history of what he's been discussing in his, whether it's the political theater or the series of television shows or beyond, right? And so the Zelensky effect really is something that started happening in 2019, if we're talking about how Zelensky had an effect on the general electorate. So we started seeing that, and I can show you some graphs if you'd like, but perhaps we'll keep graphs off. Oh, you want to see graphs?
Okay.
The interesting thing what happened in 2019 initially, and this is what when the term Zelensky effect was coined in our research team, was that we noted that those who right before the presidential election wanted to leave the country, but were Democrats, but were protesters, but had liberal values, but were younger and wanted to leave the country because they just didn't see a future for themselves, reversed on their position of leaving the country in the supplemental surveys that we continued to ask individuals. So the first thing was, we noted that youth, males, and this very interesting cohort in the Ukrainian electorate started having more faith in the state of Ukraine as a place where they can build their future. That was interesting to us for a variety of reasons, because we were comparing data collected in Poland and Morocco and Argentina, and we did not see this flip in 2019, 2020, and other places in other contexts. Then later we started following, also at that time over the years, we started following different dispositions and attitudes. So when it comes to Euro-Atlanticist positions, we find a statistically significant, robust result of those who voted for Zelensky or those who voted for his party in July 2019, if they did not hold pro-Euro-Atlanticist positions prior to 2019 or in 2019, over the course of the next 3 years, they were much more likely to move to a pro-Euro-Atlanticist position, support NATO accession and EU accession, in quite dramatic numbers. And we discussed that at length in the book, but I also discussed that in a recent piece for Nations and Nationalities, European Ukrainians, and also in a Journal of Democracy piece that is coming out exactly about the Zelensky effect unfolding in those early years. But Lucan, the most interesting thing that happened in 2019, 2020, 2021, and then our last panel survey came at February 16th, 2022. And by the way, we were doing supplemental qualitative discourse analysis of focus groups, of content of his speeches, and also all this stuff. But in those surveys, we noted this giant jump to support for democracy. And when I started to see that, you know, after 3 waves of panels, I started to see just how giant that jump is. Just to give you a context, in 2019, 39% of the Ukrainian population thought that democracy was the best system for Ukraine, okay? By February 2022, February 16th, 2022, that number jumped to just under 60%. I scoured every single major survey of democratizing contexts around the world, Latin America, Eastern Europe. Nowhere could I find a similar jump in a 2-year period. And again, what was happening there? Those who voted for Zelensky in 2019 or voted for his party in 2019 were the most likely to move to a pro-democratic position. They were the most likely to rally around democracy in that 2-year period, which was a tripartite crisis of economic crisis, wartime, pandemic, and yet these people rallied to democracy at surprising rates. That is a Zelensky effect. How does that happen? Exactly in the sorts of ways that I think my colleagues will discuss and have discussed already, in the tone of civic inclusivity that is present throughout all of his theatrical work, but very specifically in that 3rd season of Servant of the People. If you haven't seen third season yet, watch it. Really shame on you if you haven't seen it yet, because that was campaign material, right? Informally, but it was full-on campaign material. It places emphasis on civic unity above everything and civic duty repeatedly. Civic duty of who? Of ordinary citizens. And so that's the Zelensky effect. On the flip side, though, the Zelensky effect is also, he is a product of the same civic nation that he is proposing himself. He is of the independence generation, those of us who were like 8 years old or so, 13 years old when Ukraine became independent. And many of these people who are now in their early 40s, mid 40s, they didn't see themselves as playing a key role in politics over the years. And he was one of those people. And he, over time, saw a way for him to play an important role in Ukrainian politics. So he's as much a reflection of civic identity in Ukraine as he clearly, through his messaging, through his actions, through his words, brought people on to the mission of civic duty to defend the state under the umbrella of civic identity.
So maybe just go ahead, Volodya, and then yeah.
Well, let me jump in. I just want to emphasize how significant and surprising it is that the election of Zelensky and the presidency of Zelensky urged Ukrainians to support democracy stronger, because as much as I know about his series, I'm one of those few Ukrainians who never saw it. But I know enough from your work, guys, and I know enough about what he has been doing since being elected to say that as much as he says he could be a source of inspiration for voting, for aspiring, for uniting, he did not seem to be instilling a sense of the value of democracy as such, a democracy as procedure, democracy as respect to a minority voice, an opinion, democracy as respect for institutions. Yeah, as much as I know about his series, he is a strong leader working for the people and ignoring those institutions which stand in his way. Yeah, of serving the people. And I just finished an article analyzing his discourse of communicating with the people as president through his direct addresses posted on social media, and he often mocked and critiqued and kind of lambasted those institutions like the judiciary, like the media, who he believed did not support him enough, and in this way kind of prevented him from serving the people enough. Yeah, so that is even more remarkable that such a person, such a president could instill in the population willingness to support democracy more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I know that Jessica is chomping at the bit, but Marta has been incredibly patient here. So do you want to add to this? I mean, you've
Yes, absolutely. I'm one of these people who was very skeptical about Zelensky. As Ola mentioned, in 2019, we had these long discussions. My concerns were about his lack of political experience and the motivations, which Volodya has already referred to. Why is this actor, businessman, going into politics? And I have to say my skepticism maintained right up until February, because his performance as president, I thought, was mixed. And then the full-scale invasion happened. And I, unlike Volodya, did watch Servant of the People when it just was running, because I was thinking of it as research. I was going to be writing an article about how he won an election without campaigning by using this TV show. So I had to watch the TV show. I'm now rewatching it, and I'm seeing very different things. When the full-scale invasion started, like everybody, I was glued to all sources available, and I started watching Zelensky's speeches because I'm one of these night owls. So when I heard about the invasion, I immediately found Zelensky's first speech, which you remember, he's still looking like the president with his suit and tie. And he basically announces an emergency situation. And I got hooked. I started watching all of his videos. And being not just a political scientist, but also a historian, I thought, the internet is unreliable. I need to archive these. So I started archiving them, but there was so much going on. A former student reached out and I said, Yaren, can you help, please? And she said, sure. So she started collecting all of the speeches. And then things sort of calmed down a little bit. And I thought, oh, let's do an analysis. So we did an analysis of the first 50 days of war. And what I think everybody will agree with is that his communication skills are one of the most effective tools in this war, in the information war. This man has charisma. He knows how to construct a message. He knows how to deliver a message. And what happened after February is he set the agenda to Ukraine's story. If you think back to even January and early February, news reporting was Russia is amassing troops along the border. Russia's president says this. It was Russia was always leading the news, and the news stories were framed according to Russia's, I don't even want to say narrative, but it was always Russia-led. What these speeches did is it shifted the agenda, and Ukraine is now leading the narrative. So instead of Russia is afraid of this, it's Zelensky is being quoted on international media, and he's setting the agenda. So when these messages of, we're launching a special operation would lead the news, now it is Ukraine's president says this in response to. And I think that is an extremely powerful thing to be doing as a political leader. And as has already been mentioned, Zelensky is probably the best known political leader in the world. I don't know that I can think of any parallels, and it's precisely because of his communication skills. Impact of this domestically and internationally. In my view, Ukrainians are not fighting because Zelensky is speaking to them. He is reaching out personally. Ukrainians, and if you listen to his speeches, which I do, how does he start his speeches? It's personalized. Great people of a great country. Good health to you, united country. Strong people of a steel country. He uses these kinds of phrases to appeal to people. It's very personalized, but it's also very clear that he is inspired by the people, that he is referring to their greatness, that it's not like, I'm the leader, follow me. It's like, you guys are great, let's do this together. And I think that is an extremely effective communication technique. Internationally, he is tailoring his messages very effectively. Again, the British Parliament, I think that was one of the first ones that he did. We will fight on the beaches. Hiroshima, Japan, he's using all of the references for each specific country while delivering the same message. We need help, we need armaments, we need sanctions. So he's on message, but he's doing it very effectively. And I think Luke Harding, who's the journalist from The Guardian, he put it, he's giving a masterclass in messaging to all political leaders. The question that people kept thinking about, and I kept thinking, is, okay, he's writing a war, he's running a country, who's writing these speeches? And he's got a team, obviously, but one of the leaders of his speech writing team, a young guy, these people always hide in the background, Dmitry Litvin, he spoke to Luke Harding and said that the way the speeches are constructed is that Zelensky makes the messages and they just package them. So Zelensky doesn't actually write each and every single speech. He just says, this is what I want. And then they sort of put the words together. But if you watch these speeches, and I'm sure most of you do, he delivers them very, very effectively. And I think that is the power, that it's a gift. And he's also very lucky that his opponent is so uncharismatic and such a poor communicator. So on the one hand, you have this very, a leader who he can relate to him. He's speaking to you. He's not afraid to use first names, Justin, Boris, Emmanuel. He's not afraid occasionally to shame people. When he was speaking to the Israeli parliament, he said, you guys aren't helping us. So he is, I think, a fascinating character in terms of his communication skills. The big question I'm left with, though, is how much can he, I don't know how to phrase this politely, but we saw the G7 meeting today. And what is Zelensky asking for? Again, we need weapons, we need support, anti-missile defense. What did they get from Canada? We're going to send you some trainers to Poland. So I don't want to overstate the power of his communication skills in terms of actually delivering what Ukraine needs. But his face is all over the news, and I saw a front page cover that he was voted the most powerful Jew in the world, more powerful than even Blinken. So that, I think, in and of itself is an accomplishment. And the last point is his stamina amazes me. This is day 224, 23, and he is doing this. I'm sometimes too tired to watch his speeches. I do, and those of you who are my Facebook friends, you see I'm always sharing them because I think it's important to listen. But he has tremendous stamina. So I always like to see what he's going to say next. Olga's had her hand up for a while. What did you want to comment?
I think well, Jessica and then Olga, I think.
Oh, sorry, I can't see what Jessica.
Good.
Thanks. So I wonder, I think it's worth pointing out, sort of linking Olga and Volodya's comments, the remarkable consistency of these messages across time as well. Just thinking about the messages that you mentioned in Servant of the People, Olga, in the third season, like these are messages that appear in his work years before, right? And especially with Studio Kvartal 95. In 2019, I wrote a series of articles in the context of American impeachment about Zelensky, including about this very point, right? That they use, and these aren't necessarily democratic values, right? But they're biblical values of responsibility that are built into the national narrative that they tell, right? Through their songs. And so I think it's worth sort of highlighting that consistency across time. But then that also raises an interesting question, right? Olga, your findings about support for democracy, right? How much of that is a product of more, the recent articulation through the sitcom, right? How much of that is a product of an entire generation sort of growing up with these messages, or how much might be a product of, and I'm sure you consider this hypothesis, but I'm curious to know about it, thinking about the society side of already several years of decentralization reforms, right? How is it that the experience of Hromada and local responsibility actually might be behind, right, this effect of support for democracy? So as much as I have made a lot of arguments in print about Zelensky and his leadership, right? In part because I have to say I'm looking at this from the perspective which is a little bit different from some of my colleagues. I don't have the skepticism that perhaps I might have started with, because I first sort of got interested in Zelensky and his comedy, although not in his politics and his policies, which I might have some differences with. From an apartment room in Voronezh in 1997, right? So I've sort of been following the consistency of these messages, but as much as that, that's compelling, I still wonder, like, how much of this is really about decentralization? And so I'm interested to hear it from our colleagues, right? Especially from Olga and also from Volodya, because of your skepticism about what you think about that.
Well,
I'm tempted to just let Volodya respond there to that last question, but I wanted to pick up on a few threads. So there's a lot of agreement in all of our presentations here, and there's just some small things that we find disagreement with, or perhaps the way we approach a certain aspect or element is slightly different. So I want to just reiterate, I really like a lot Marta's article. We did very similar research in the book, but we cite her article and her colleague's article because it's absolutely brilliant. And what I think Marta outlined there, the people-focused nature of the message is so important in a wartime context. And then I think just to highlight it once more, the different messaging to different audiences that not all of us are perhaps paying attention to as much, because most of us focus on the messaging to the Ukrainian people in our work, right? But here I think it's how Zelensky has been able to do this diverse messaging, and I think there I learned a lot from Marta's paper, but who writes them? And I want to Marta and I have actually discussed this on Ukrainian Independence Day, and I went back and I re-interviewed people let's just say they're very, very in the know, extremely in the know, under Chatham House rules, because this is a wartime context, and it's not cool to be talking to researchers when you're working within the administration, right? So it's exactly what Marta said, that the ideas are always laid out in advance by Zelensky. Some things are pitched to him, but apparently he very strongly opposes some of the pitched ideas, precisely because he perhaps grasps what is a useful messaging and not, as Marta said. But also he completely apparently rewrites speeches in the middle of the night. So this ability to not sleep, I don't know how this man survives. And then doing a lot off the cuff. They keep saying that, you know, when you saw him yesterday holding his phone, that a lot of that is, some of it is prepared, some of it is off the cuff, and that he repeatedly does this. And that ability in itself is something that I think, because of where he comes from, is truly impressive. But here I want to go to some of Volodya's points on institutions. I don't disagree with Volodya that I think some of the relationships that the Zelensky team, I don't think it's Zelensky on his own, but the Zelensky broader team and the party and the cabinet had with different institutions outside of the cabinet have been contentious, and at times did seem like they were ademocratic. At the same time, I think it's very important to note that previous presidents also had contentious relationships with similar institutions, in fact. And I think that there was, at least in 2019, even as far as 2020, there was a reluctance of a variety of individuals to work with Zelensky's team and work with his cabinet more broadly. And there, when we go back and we interview some of these people, again, under Chatham House rules for the book, I am surprised by how unrepentant they are of really an opportunity lost to work with the administration in 2019. Because it's very clear that some of these mistakes that Zelensky does make when interacting with the institutions that Volodya already mentioned, but also in some other avenues in terms of building his team and who he gave trust to, perhaps who he allowed into the team. That was a product of a lot of very well-connected, experienced, bright people refusing to work with him and his team because of their perception of what this Russian revanchist plot and all this other stuff. And I think that is that. So people are partly to blame, right? Zelensky made many mistakes. And I want to just highlight a few things that we have not talked about. We talked about Odin plus Odin when it's owned by Kolomoisky. That's one thing. How about when Odin plus Odin, when Zelensky started as a producer at Odin plus Odin around 2004, he was at Odin plus Odin during the Orange Revolution. He was not one of those people going out in public defending the protesters. He was not yet of the group that joined the civil resistance to oligarchy publicly, at least in that point, right? Another thing I think we need to mention, he was the general producer of Inter. Everyone forgets about Inter. Everyone keeps talking about Kolomoisky and Odin plus Odin. Inter was an oligarchic channel, incredibly problematic. If you, in many ways, we can review that. We don't have time to. He was the general producer of that channel. He was one of the most important players in the media and politics sphere of the country, but he was just not as visible in that role, right, to the general public. And I think that needs further investigation. His naivete on war, what Volodya already mentioned, we shouldn't just gloss over that. It was naivete. It was ridiculous to say we should just talk when there was already multiple years of war that wasn't working. It couldn't have been just that Poroshenko wasn't good at negotiations, right? I think that was naive. And so there are multiple things that we can point out that are hugely problematic in the history of how Zelensky becomes a president and leader. But then we do, and to answer your questions, what I think is happening in the democracy support, it's the policy successes. So there's multiple policy successes. We don't have time to go into them right now. We can at a later date. But the policy successes that I think are the most important for support of democracy are not overturning your predecessors' policies, not overturning the language law, which he could have, okay? He did not. Not overturning other policies that maybe he would have done differently. He did not. He, in fact, defended them and said that's not the way we do democracy. There's an actual line about the language law where he says that. That is him doubling down on the rules of the game, that institutions matter. And when you come in, you shouldn't just wipe clean what your predecessor did. You have to respect that that was part of the democratic process.
Thanks. Emily?
Yeah, thanks. I was going to mention exactly that point, and I think you and I talked about this before, and I was going to say, somebody and I talked about this, and I couldn't remember who it was, but it was you. But I think that's kind of the key part about the decentralization, right? That's one of those reforms that really needed time for people to understand what their role was in that reform and how that allowed them to participate in democracy in a totally novel way that they hadn't been given the chance to before. And so going back to, I think, what Marta was saying before about, who's responding to whom, Zelensky is responding to the power of the Ukrainian response, right? That it's obvious in how he addresses people. But, the fact that I think there's something interesting going on where Zelensky is also given a little bit more of a leash. I don't know if this is a good metaphor, but he's been given a couple of chances to try stuff out, recognize the error that he has made, and retreat and kind of say, okay, let's reassess, let's listen to the response and see maybe what the policy should be, or a different advisor who could tell me, right? Like, he's been given a little bit more leeway to figure out the political strategy than a lot of other Ukrainian leaders have been. And I don't know if that's because he has this past where people think they know him as a person, his character has played somebody who learns from his mistakes, so maybe the actual person can do that too. I think it's an open question where that comes from. But I think especially in pitching the Steinmeier formula as a way to end the war, right? People protested, people came into the streets, and he said, okay, maybe that's not going to work. Let's talk about something else, right? These are big issues that people have a lot invested in. And instead of just barreling forward with what he wanted to do, he was able to kind of negotiate. And I think that's also something that allowed people, when it came to late February, that allowed people to put the trust in him that he's obviously proven, he deserved, but that maybe a different person in his position, wouldn't have been able to garner that belief in the fact that he could do what he has been asked to do now.
Thanks. So I will get to you, Volodya, but before we haven't really touched on this, I wanted to raise the issue of, Zelensky's background as a kind of native Russian speaker and kind of impact that you guys think that it's had on his leadership. I try to imagine a counterfactual scenario in which you had had a Western Ukrainian or someone who had sort of tied their political mast to sort of Galician type nationalism and how that might have shaped the conflict. Can any of you want to talk about that, Volodya, or is there somebody else want to jump in? Jessica?
Okay, let me talk about this a bit, and also about other issues that were mentioned. Let me start with decentralization that Jessica kind of raised. When Zelensky became president, he started behaving in ways not dissimilar from some of his predecessors. Kuchma, Yanukovych, meaning he tried to grab more powers than his mandate allowed him. And that he did more successfully, for example, than Poroshenko, maybe less successfully than Yanukovych, but definitely he did not want to be constrained by his mandate. He wanted, in a populist way, he wanted to serve the people without this constraint of institutions. Also, he presented policies currently implemented as his achievements and his government's achievements, rather than something with background, something originated under his predecessors. And this decentralization reform is a good example. So he often refers to the centralization as something his government is doing or even has initiated, even though it is obvious that it was started under Poroshenko. Not saying that this is Poroshenko's kind of achievement. Yeah, Poroshenko was just one of many players. Actually, it was the Maidan's achievement. Yeah, Maidan gave this impulse, yeah, to start many reforms, including this. Yeah. So coming to this being Russian speaker. Yeah. So he was perceived with antipathy or with skepticism by many Ukrainian speaking elites, by many Ukrainian speaking activists. But his election with 73% of votes demonstrated that for many Ukrainians, his being Russian speaker was not an issue. And which was a very good feature of Ukrainian politics. Similarly, how being a Ukrainian speaker was not an issue for many Russian speakers when they voted for Yushchenko, even though then language was so politicized, then language division was so emphasized in politics. Yeah. Now, so then we had 52%. Now we had 73% because the issue was less politicized. But that gave him, of course, a tremendous mandate, tremendous powers. But on the other hand, that presented a choice whether to get rid of some constraints, including this language law, which he initially perceived exactly as a constraint, kind of inherited from his predecessors. But that was, as Ola rightly mentioned, was one of the first kind of his mature moves, mature achievements, yeah, to demonstrate that he understood that he was president for all Ukrainians, and he didn't need to eliminate the heritage valued by this 25%, yeah, and so then he started speaking exclusively Ukrainian in public. He started improving his Ukrainian. That increased trust in him on the part of many Ukrainian speakers. Of course, there was still skepticism as long as he insisted on this "надо просто перестать стрелять," as long as he tried to instill this Steinmeier formula, as long as he continued stupidly, I would say, criticizing Poroshenko every occasion he could, that was problematic. But then, for me, his first sign of inclusivity, which even I could not deny, was his behavior during the COVID pandemic. He behaved very responsibly. He was nothing like Trump or Orban or even Putin. So he assumed responsibility. He responded to recognize the challenge, the tremendous challenge, and he responded to this challenge maturely and responsibly. And he called on everybody to do that. And that was, of course, a great thing to do. That was also a time of his first very visible conflict with local authorities, with mayors in particular. Yeah, that was, on the one hand, a bad sign that he was reluctant to recognize that they had constitutionally delineated prerogatives to be respected. On the other hand, he recognized that they were trying to be more populist than he was, and he was more responsive politician, more responsive leader than they were. Yeah, and so now coming now to the wartime leadership, because that was supposed to be our topic, and we are coming keep rolling back to pre-war times. Yeah, so to pre-February 24th time. So during the wartime, he demonstrated once again his willingness to admit to assume responsibility to respond to the challenge. Yeah, although he did not want to believe in this war insights advice about the imminent invasion. He didn't want to call on Ukrainians to get prepared, but he changed that overnight, or kind of in that very first morning. Yeah, and since then he was very insistent that in calling the whole world to help Ukraine, in calling on Ukrainians to stand firm and fight back and persevere, and that was very important. Also important was that his discourse continued to be very inclusive, even in time of war, which is rare and which is remarkable. Yeah, he did not want to exclude any internal, any domestic group, either ethnic, like ethnic Russians, either linguistic, either religious, like Moscow Patriarchy, for example. Either regional. He never excluded, never othered any domestic group. The only domestic groups he kind of put in problematic light were some elite Slavs, like some politicians, some who for example fled to Monaco. He said we made different choices. Some have chosen Mariupol and some have chosen Monaco. Yeah, but basically his main and consistent object of othering was Russia. Yeah, but also, and so external enemy and no internal divisions. No, he in a way he ceased to be populist in that he ceased to be looking for enemies among the domestic elites who disagree with him, who constrain his powers. On the other hand, his discourse of Russia on Russia was not as anti-Russian as many Ukrainians want him to have. Yeah. His discourse on Russia is still directed against the Russian state and the Russian army invading Ukraine, but not the Russian people. Definitely, he still is reluctant to embrace this fully anti-Russian version, an anti-Russian narrative of Ukrainian identity. He still presents Ukrainian identity in a way that it might be problematic to some, including to myself, when I look at how he presents the history of the Ukrainian blue and yellow flag. His history basically originates in 1991. He doesn't mention Cossacks. He doesn't mention Ukrainian People's Republic. He doesn't mention Ukrainian Insurgent Army. So he doesn't build on that. So he doesn't want to be consistently anti-Russian. So in this way, he remains inclusive, very much inclusive. On the other hand, he still prevents Ukraine from kind of burning bridges completely with Russia. So in this way, he still keeps Ukraine within this orbit that relations with Russia in some ways might be repaired. He doesn't emphasize that, but inconspicuously, he still keeps Ukraine kind of anchored in that post-Soviet space. So in this way, he remains true to his constituency. Yeah, he remains loyal to those people who didn't want to be so anti-Russian, who wanted to be Ukrainian without antagonizing people across the border. Yeah, so in this way, he still has not become kind of the opposite of what he used to be, even though the war might seem to be an occasion to completely change his discourse and his attitude. So in this way, he remains consistent and he remains responsible. He remains an inclusive Ukrainian president of his whole citizenry at war.
I'm just going to jump in here, Volodya. You've got to watch Servant of the People. You really do need to see it, because I agreed with a lot of what you said, but the historical stuff, you really need to see that he does not start in 1991. And the speeches that he's been giving since 24th February, there are many, many historical references. And the Servant of the People, he keeps dropping in historical references all the way back to the era of the princes, never mind the Kuzykia and the so on. So that's something. I'm going to be really brief because we don't have a lot of time and there's 5 of us and there's questions. 2 points about language. I think we need a separate panel on language, but the issue of language, I think, is always overstated. I mean, Zelensky has, like every president before him, comes into office being a Russian speaker, and he learns to speak Ukrainian pretty quickly. So that's nothing unusual, nothing new. The thing that is new is that he learned to speak English really quickly too. Because if you saw his interviews, like before he was elected to BBC, he started off with a few sentences and then said, I'm going to switch to Russian now. So his language, his ability to communicate, his language skills are really impressive. The other point that I haven't heard anybody talk about that I just wanted to mention is this is a panel about Zelensky, but Zelensky is one of a team. And I think that we need to not focus completely on, Ukraine is Zelensky and he's doing everything. He has a team. And I think some of his team members are in some ways even more impressive than him. I mean, Kuleba is my personal favorite. He rocks. If you guys saw him on the Colbert Show, you saw him on CNN with Christiana Anandpur yesterday. Talk about being on message, but not just this touchy-feely stuff that Zelensky is really good at. He's good at the political messaging. The thing that concerns me is his team is also full of people like Arestovich, who is such a, I don't know what he's doing in that team. He continues to write all of his stuff in Russian, and his messaging is sort of all over the place. So the team, I think, is as important as the leader. And Luca, you had this nice photograph on your Facebook page from the early part of the war, where Zelensky says, and he says this in one of his speeches, you got to see, because he's doing his speech, and then he turns the phone and says, I'm not the only one working tonight. And he pans the camera and he shows all the other guys sitting there. So I think that's also something when we're analyzing Zelensky to also look at who his team members are. And I'll stop there because a few other people have their hands up, but there are things that he's doing that are not great, like in the education sphere and various other places. But I will let Jessica and Ola.
So Jessica, I think one of the big reliefs for many of us studying Ukrainian politics is that we haven't even heard, no one talks about Galicia anymore, or Western and Eastern Ukraine, which I've talked about in the past, but I feel like that's almost a sort of kind of left discussion of Ukrainian politics. What impact can you just talk more about the impact of Zelensky's constituency, which, in Central and Eastern Ukraine, sort of probably more Russophile parts of the population, and what impact you think that's had on his leadership?
Sure. So, and this is related, of course, to the previous question, and I do have a comment also about his team in response to Marta, but after this. So I think probably the most important thing for us to keep in mind about Zelensky and as a Russified Ukrainian, and with respect to others who grew up speaking Russian and continue to do so in daily life, is that even as in 2014, the Kremlin provided a clear external enemy for those living in the east and south of Ukraine, Zelensky in his work on the stage and as president really provided a conceptual language that made it possible for Russified Ukrainians to consider themselves patriots, right? So, and here I think we need to make a clear distinction between nationalists and patriots, nationalism and patriotism. And there was kind of always this, gray zone, right? For Russified Ukrainians for whom a national identity, the antipode of, if we think about the antipode of a Soviet legacy, is often the Galician identity that you invoked, Lucan. Zelensky comes along and through his stage work, right, articulates a set of concepts that Russified Ukrainians can use to think about themselves as believers in Ukraine, as patriots, right? And so this is a sort of a major contribution. And I would add, I believe it's also one of the main reasons that the Kremlin fears him so, right? Because he has sort of provided a way for people who speak Russian to think of themselves as not loyal to the Kremlin. And, you know, now that the Kremlin has is pushing imitations of referenda, you know, we also have to think about what that might mean for the Russian periphery, right? Because Zelensky has been loved all over the Russian-speaking world for a very long time, and not only within the borders of Ukraine. So I think that's one point. And then the other point about identity I would add here is that, and this is something I wrote about in these 2019 articles and then also much more recently, but one of the sort of interesting discursive moves that Zelensky and his troop make from this stage is not just to make space for Russified Ukrainians, but also to take the sort of the linguistic diversity as a concept, as a category of analysis, which we as social scientists love to sort of place at the center, right, of our analysis, as Marta mentioned. But he then breaks down all these identity categories. If we think back to his 2019 New Year's greeting, for example, right, the categories of analysis he uses there are like people who like olives, people who don't watch Game of Thrones, like people who don't like to use plastic. He breaks down what it can mean to be Ukrainian into all of these different, you know, this really multifaceted idea. And I think it ends up creating more space for unity. Right, it really creates, you know, this out of many one, right, kind of possibility, which is much easier than trying to find one out of a polarized situation. And so I think that that's a real sort of contribution, and it's echoed in some ways in coming back to Marta's point about teamwork and the other members of his team. That I think when we analyze him, we also have to be careful not to take what he says as sort of exemplifying everything about his position, because he works in, you know, ensemble theater, right? He's part of a team. He's always been part of a team. It's very clear when you look at sort of the pronouncements made over Twitter, over video, in different venues in the same 24-hour period, right? By Zelensky, Podolyak, Kim, Arestovich, and these other figures, that everybody's sort of playing a certain role. And it all works together to push things in a particular direction, but no one component, no one speaking part is everything, right? And Zelensky himself, I think, is also, he's playing a particular role, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the entire philosophy behind it. So I think that's another sort of way in which something different is going on.
Just very quickly, the language, 2004, Russian speakers were on the Maidan protesting during the Orange Revolution. This isn't Zelensky. This has been there for much, much longer.
Good. So I just wanted to, definitely a good point you make there, Marta, and certainly I believe it's Olga who, at least to me, you know, sort of emphasized the importance of Russian speakers in Euromaidan. I just want to echo your point, Jessica. I happened to be in Moscow during the 2019 election, which the Russian media covered quite freely. And I can tell you all of my Russian friends were in love with Zelensky. I mean, he obviously had deep appeal. I mean, primarily as an outsider, as someone who sort of was, you know, the appeal of many sort of outsiders in politics, it was very much the case. I actually want to sort of talk to Murray Rubin, who is asked from the audience. He says, I'm a 91-year-old Jew born in Canada. My mother and father came from Ukraine. They told me that Ukraine was very anti-Semitic. Would you comment on how Ukrainians elected a Jewish president? I think that's, so I don't know who wants to take that on, but the Jewishness. Volodya.
That is exactly the demonstration that Ukraine is not anti-Semitic, that Ukraine is not xenophobic. Ukraine elected not only a Jewish president, Ukraine elected kind of pronouncedly Russian-speaking president. Yeah, Ukraine elected a president who built a career on the post-Soviet market rather than within Ukraine precisely. So all these things did not prevent Ukraine, and his products were in Russian. Yeah, so all the time during this supposedly harsh Ukrainization of Ukrainian media. Yeah, so that did not did not prevent Ukrainians from assuming he would be one of them and he would serve them. Yeah, so that of course was kind of a naivete on the part of the voters, and that was one more reason for the supposedly sophisticated constituencies to be appalled at this prospect of this complete outsider to be elected just because he played he played well the role of a good president. Yeah, but that also means that we as analysts should look beyond this discourse, beyond this virtual personality when we talk about his leadership style. I want to relate to what Marta mentioned about education, but education is just one of many domains actually where his leadership is problematic, where his appointment policies, where his bill initiated policies, where his fund allocating policies are problematic, and of course this splendid speeches, splendid videos kind of overshadow all that, of course for international audiences, but also for many Ukrainians. And so additional leverage he got from this early war decision to switch off this all channels and instill this united marathon. Yeah, so only one voice can be heard nationwide. I mean, on air TV. Of course, there is cable TV. So this is something which tremendously constitute to his leadership, to his hegemony in agenda setting. But of course, other issues need to be raised, discussed, and corrected. Yeah, and so as long as he is so tremendously popular and powerful and persuasive, these corrections are not made, and Ukraine, and in a way, Ukraine kind of accumulates problems which need to be dealt with at some point.
Okay. I'm going to get to you, Olga. I've not forgotten. You've been very patient, but Emily has to get off, so I'm going to hand the floor to her. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I think two things here. First of all, this I think this question also has an assumption, and there is a lot of assumption that in Ukraine, he's campaigning on some kind of identity politics where he's trying to present himself as representative of this population that he comes from, and that's simply not the case. And so I think it's very easy from where we're sitting, not being, steeped in Ukrainian political culture, to assume that that's part of the process of how people are thinking about voting for him. And I just don't think that's especially true. I think his public image is far, far more important. But I want to also point out, just to reiterate what I was saying at the very beginning, Zelensky has been a representative of possibility and opportunity more than anything really concrete in this way. He was never like making promises to change the position of Jews in Ukraine or something, but the fact of his existence and his success means it's a kind of symbolic representation of that possibility for others. And just speaking from my own research with leftist political activists, they saw their possibilities for where they could intervene in Ukrainian politics as completely closed off by every single previous president that had existed in Ukraine. But Zelensky's recognition of the plurality of voices that existed in Ukraine and that had the desire to participate in politics, that was enough for them for many of them to vote for him. And that's people who historically don't vote against everybody, ask other people not to vote, right? These are people who are very critical of how political processes and institutions work. And instead they voted for Zelensky because of that potential for plurality. And I think, I really do think that that's what he is representing now. And that's exactly what everybody here has already said. By recognizing that plurality, that creates more of an opportunity for unity and patriotism than by saying there's only one way, this is how you be Ukrainian. He's showing that there's so many different ways to be Ukrainian. I think that's what a lot of his success is due to.
Thank you. Olga.
Well, there's so much that's been said. And Lucan, I wanted to reply to your questions that you posed to us also, just on language and Halitana. I think these aren't things that we should overlook. I think the story is a little bit more complex than what we have talked about so far. First of all, Volodya's research extensively shows how there has been a shedding of Russian identity, and that Ukrainian identity has been strongly tied to a civic one, not an ethno-linguistic one. Some work that I'm doing with Volodya as well currently on the topic. But I think there's a very long established history of research that shows exactly this. So the question of Russian-speaking patriots, I don't think that's something that Zelensky was promoting in any way, particularly that we too are patriots. He was acknowledging, so I think connecting to Marta's point, that just simply is the case, that Russian speakers for the most part are increasingly patriots and have a civic identity, even though they speak Russian at home or in their private lives or at work. So very much connecting this idea that again, Volodya's research shows so eloquently, that since 1991, Russian speakers increasingly would identify with the Ukrainian state primarily. Their patriotism grew, but they spoke Russian at home or at work or otherwise. And even the patterns of speech also change over time. So I think he is more just a product of that rather than championing that. What happens in 2019 is Southeasterners see themselves in him as being mirrored in their experiences. So it's not so much that he tried to bring that to the fore, whether it's in his theatrical work or in his presidential speeches. He just simply was one of them, doing the right thing that any good Ukrainian citizen would be doing, and they saw themselves mirrored. And we have a lot of evidence for that, by the way, in a load of surveys and focus groups and other things that we've conducted over the last few years. But I just wanted to very quickly, New Year's Eve address that Jessica mentioned is a very interesting example, because he says, when he says his name, he says it in Russian. And then as he's making the announcement, he switches that he's going to run for president, he switches into Ukrainian. And so I am Vladimir Zelensky, and that's the last time he refers to himself publicly as such. Volodymyr Zelensky is how he is for the rest. And that, I think, is a very interesting moment in time where he again is mirroring the daily lived realities of ordinary patriotic citizens from the southeast of Ukraine, right? Rather than he's just exemplifying it through his being. But I did want to correct two things. Repeatedly, Zelensky stresses that which Holoborodko said, or that which he says in his speeches, are his words, right? And he has said that on numerous occasions.
Wait, so for those who haven't watched it, just tell you who is Holoborodko. Yeah.
Holoborodko is the fictional character that becomes president, the history teacher turned president. So I think we need to just acknowledge that, and if we want to do a forensic analysis of what is his and his not ideas and speeches, he at least repeatedly says that. The other thing is on the expansion of decentralization under his government. We have actually looked through the way he talks about that, Volodya, and he does not claim that it's his teams. He uses the word continued, expand, build, finish, taking it to its necessary end. So he does say he finally got the job done, while those guys didn't, maybe that sort of thing. But he always extends it that it's expansion, continuation, building. And I think a perfect example of that is, well, not only the restructuring of the Hromadas, but also the New Village program that was initiated in March 2021. That is actually, when you look at how the effects, even of that 1 year of the New Village program in Ukraine, and then what happens in the villages that benefited from that program over the course of 2022, you see a lot of really interesting patterns. But I wanted to double down on what Marta said in her intervention about history. Volodya, this guy is an erudite lover of history, okay? He is, you don't want to believe it, I know, but you really, really need to start just, I didn't want to believe it in 2019 either, but he actually is obsessed with history, right? The theme of the history teacher in Servant of the People, his love of Tim Snyder, who, by the way, he obsessively has been reading for years before he was president, and other historians. And repeatedly in his speeches, he constantly, but he does it so simply that you might miss it. And I missed it oftentimes. He talks about all of a sudden a character from 100 years ago in the middle of a speech about Ukrainians needing to work abroad in Poland or in Italy, right? He talks about the Scythian leaders. He talks about Skovoroda repeatedly. He loves Skovoroda. Khmelnytsky. He constantly harps back to dissidents. And here I want to just bring back this Halichina, Southeast Ukraine dynamic that we've been incorporating into our questions and comments. The dissidents didn't actually mostly come from Halichina, right? They didn't, in fact, mostly come from even central Ukraine. Dissidents came from all over Ukraine, and some of the most impressive individuals came from places like Odessa or Dyuba from Donetsk, or Volodymyr Holoborodko, who came from Luhansk, right? Who was spreading work of Dzubas and then ended up in prison. Constantly Zelensky talks about them. He has a personal knowledge of them. And the people we spoke to that know him best say that he sometimes just, in the middle of those conversations about speeches, he'll pull one of these historical factoids that people who you might think know history better than Zelensky does don't know about. And he'll be like, yes, it's like that treatise of whatever, or that poem or whatever. So I think history is something that he actually cares deeply about. His interpretation of history, I think, will be very different from your own, Volodya, but nonetheless, he uses it repeatedly to show that there's a long history of what is today the modern Ukrainian state and of the different peoples that occupied it historically and today.
Thank you. So unless Volodya wants to make a quick response, we're going to have to wrap it up.
Yeah, okay, just very quickly. Of course, he mentions history. Of course, he refers to some historical points. What I'm saying is that his narrative is still very selective and okay, very different from the traditional nationalist or national narrative of Ukrainian history. He still tries to combine the national narrative and the Soviet narrative, or anti-Russian and pro-Russian narrative. So he still wants Ukraine to be somehow friendly to the whole world, and in this way, like I said, he remains inclusive and loyal to his constituency, but at the same time he prevents Ukraine from breaking with Russia completely. Whether this is good or bad at time of war, we can disagree on, but let's acknowledge both parts.
Okay. So I think we'll wrap it up there. It was a wonderful discussion. And I thank you all, Jessica, Volodya, Marta, and Emily, who had to leave for another appointment. Thank you so much. And we will, I just wanted to advertise, next I'll see you in a week and a half. We're going to discuss actually how Ukrainian identity has been shaped by the war. We're going to have with us Dominique Arel. We're going to have our own non-resident fellow, Petro Kuzik. And most shockingly, for those of on the webinar is going to be Bob Magachi, Professor Bob Magachi, who I think has not used a computer since since they were invented. So anyways, it'll be a real treat. So I look forward to seeing you again, and thank you so much again to the panelists for a really truly wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Volodya. Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe.
Thanks.